All right. Well, welcome to another episode of Policy Gone Viral. I'm here with Florida Director Greg Newburn from Families Against Mandatory Minimums. Thanks for taking a few minutes of your time of social distancing to be with us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. Thank you.
So the impact of COVID-19 is really being felt across every element of society, and especially the criminal justice system, and that's kind of what we're going to chat about today. What are the impacts and the concerns with the virus spread as it pertains to criminal justice?
Yeah, so a lot of the strategies that we're using on the outside to reduce the spread of the virus, to mitigate the spread of the virus, are simply impossible to do, or at least really difficult to do inside a jail or a prison. You can't do the kinds of social distancing. You can't just quarantine yourself away. You can't isolate yourself away. Um, it's difficult to do that, if not outright impossible to do it in this jail or prison setting. So that presents a unique risk all on its own. The sort of the things that we take for granted, they can't do. And then they start from a position where it's more likely to spread anyway, right? You've got crowded jails, you've got people living in very tight quarters, you have poorer sanitary conditions anyway relative to the outside. You've got poorer healthcare options, unfortunately, inside jails and prisons. So if you were a virus and you were looking for the ideal location to insert yourself and spread, you can't do any better than a jail or a prison. So it's the threat, I think, is unique and uniquely bad inside jails and prisons, and that's why I think you've got a whole bunch of people running around with their hair on fire trying to figure out what the best way to do to
Yeah. So what's being done at the state level or the local level? Are there any jurisdictions that are kind of trying to be more proactive right now?
Sure. At the local level, you saw, I think, some sheriffs and some state attorneys and public defenders who got together really early and said, "Hey, all right, we arrested this guy for a misdemeanor or a drug charge or a low-level misdemeanor or something, and he's got a $2,000 bond, but and he can't pay the $200 that he needs to get out. Maybe let's go and see if he really needs to be in there." And so you saw that. I think Sheriff Chronister was one of the first people to get out there and say, let's reduce our jail population. Let's try to get some of these people out in order to make our response a little more efficient and make it a little easier, and also just frankly to reduce the number of people who are potential carriers of the virus. That's number one, right? Is if you've got X number of people and you can reduce that number, you're going to have fewer people to transmit it to others. So that was a forward-thinking strategy of Sheriff Chronister, and I think you see that around the state as well. And so the more of that, the merrier. At the state level, those options are significantly more limited. The state actors don't have the kinds of flexibility that a sheriff and a state attorney and a public defender and judges have to identify people and then release them. You can't just change a sentence as easily as you might change a bond requirement at the local level. So the state officials have been much more limited in their ability to reduce the number of people in the system. That said, I think that the Department of Corrections has done just a stellar job at using the available tools to reduce the threat inside the system. I mean, it's a massive system that we have, the state prison system. You're talking 96,000 prisoners. You're talking tens of thousands more Florida Department of Corrections employees and contractors and people who come into contact with these facilities. I believe it's something along the lines of a population greater than that of more than 30 counties is when you're talking about people in the state prison system who are directly or would be directly impacted by this virus if it were inside. And so Secretary Inch took a very early step of reducing visitation, or of cutting off visitation, of cutting off volunteers, of reducing the number of people who come from the outside to the inside. They very quickly adopted CDC guidelines. And I think that they're doing everything that they can with the tools available to them to manage the crisis and to protect the people who are in their care which is exactly what we want from the people in these positions. So I've been impressed with that response, and we're hopeful that we can keep the virus out of the system. But I'm also certain that in the unfortunate event that if it does get inside and prisoners are starting to test positive and is starting to spread, I have every confidence that Secretary Inch will adapt and change the strategy to, again, reduce the harm as much as possible.
Absolutely. So in the aftermath, I mean, hopefully this is over sooner rather than later. Kind of looking at policy reform, um, uh, what kind of policy reform should we be looking at in the aftermath of all of this?
I think the number one lesson that this shows is that some of the rules that might make sense in regular times don't make sense in emergencies. And we don't have what I call the lifeboat rules. We have very inflexible rules that, again, even if you can see that they make sense in normal times, they deprive these actors of all flexibility and of all discretion when the emergencies come. I think that at the moment we sort of understood the scope and severity of this crisis, it would have been nice to have structures in place that allowed the Department of Corrections to quickly and efficiently identify vulnerable prisoners, elderly prisoners, chronically ill, low risk people, people at the tail end of a sentence with only a couple of months left,
Yeah.
and then release them. We don't have those lifeboat rules. We don't have those emergency rules. So one of the first things that I would do if I were in the legislature would be to identify some of the places where we can inject some flexibility to allow these people to do things in emergencies that we might not want them to do in normal times.
Yeah. Well, Greg, thanks so much for taking a few minutes to chat with us. I mean, we appreciate all the work that you're doing at Families Against Mandatory Minimums, your leadership and Secretary Inch's leadership, and definitely an important topic. And we appreciate you joining us.
Thank you so much. Stay safe.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.